Welcome to our free live webinar where we're going to be looking at the mother of the believers, Aisha. Allah be pleased with her. And I'm honored to have with me, as part of that discussion, Professor Jonathan Brown, who has written extensively, not only on this topic, but on the topic of Hadith and Sunnah and many other things besides that as well. So I'm honored to have him this evening with us. And this is part of a broader course that we are offering, i.e. Al-Balagh, which is looking at the seerah, or looking at the life of the Prophet, peace be upon him, which has, for reasons, been part of conversations, contentious issues have been raised about the life of the Prophet, peace be upon him. For some of us, it's contentious. For some of us, it's not so much. I remember as a young madrasa student coming across the narrations that might mention the age of the Aisha radiallahu ta'ala anha, and none of my teachers or none of the classmates, all 50 of us, found any issue with it. We sort of just read the hadith. We were reading the hadith, Bukhari back to front, if you like, and usually the teacher would stop and he would give a little bit of a commentary. But all those years ago, it wasn't an issue for many of us. And that's probably because we kind of had a familiarity with the life of the Prophet, peace be upon him. But in recent decades or so, I guess it has sometimes become an issue for some people. So we're going to be talking about that. We're also talking about a broader discussion around hadith. So Professor Brown, I'm really glad you're here with us. And I would like you to start when you're ready. And we can take this how you want. You can present. We can have a question answer format, however you want. I'm happy to be led by you. Okay, you're on mute, by the way.
I'm muted?
Oh, let me just unmute you.
I should.
You're still on mute.
I shouldn't be on mute. Am I muted?
No, we can't hear you. So we just...
Hang on one second. I figure out why. Can you hear me now?
You can hear him. Okay, I can't hear him, but that's fine. I'm happy to stop.
So can you guys hear me in the audience? Okay. Okay, good. Yeah, I don't know what's going on. So Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Thanks for inviting me. I'm always happy to talk to my brothers and sisters in the motherland in Blighty. Is that what people call it? Do people call it that, or is that like
it's great old Blighty, but it's falling apart now because it's election season. So it's a bit of a unstable.
Is that like a UKIP phrase or something, or is it like, or could regular people say that, or is it like
people say they say we are back in old Blighty? It's a regular UK thing. It's not being used by.
Okay.
We won't let the right wing take that away from us. That's our phrase.
Yeah. Okay. Good. So this it's funny. I actually just last week made a presentation about this topic. So it's fortuitous that you asked me to present on it, and we don't have a lot of time, so I'll forgo my usual hysterical jokes and just go immediately into the discussion. And I have a PowerPoint, not because it's useful actually for showing information. So I have it not because I'm trying to be lazy or anything. You guys can all see this. It's just,
yeah, we can see
it. Okay, so that's actually a picture of medieval medicine manual on childbirth in from medieval Baghdad, I think. But anyway, what's really interesting about this topic is I'm actually not at my house. I'm at my wife's friend's house. So I'm in one of the random rooms. So I have no idea what's on the wall behind me. Hopefully it's something our kids are having a play date or whatever. Okay, so basically this is not a big issue. So I mean, if you think about it, this is not Aisha's age, radiallahu ta'ala anha, is not like a Aqidah issue. It's not ma'lum min ad-din bidurura. It is essentially no importance. It's a minor historical detail. I mean, you could say it has some fiqh importance in terms of potentially what are the outer limits or established limits for when marriage can happen. But otherwise, I mean, it's it's a detail for which it's hard to imagine Muslim getting really in trouble for this, either accepting it or denying it. And there's some Muslims, Muslim scholars who are very pious people today, and otherwise pretty kind of conservative scholars who who say Aisha could not have been 15 years, not have been 9 years old when she married the Prophet. She had to be 15. And they have arguments for that based on, how much younger she was than such another person. And we know this other person was such X, Y, Z age at a certain time. I personally don't find those arguments convincing just because we have these very strong narrations from Aisha herself saying, I was 9 years old when I got married. And, let's say she didn't know exactly how old she was. Let's say she was 10 or maybe 11. I mean, that doesn't really solve the problem for what people are upset about when they talk about this. So basically, but at the same time, like I've met many people, maybe I'd say at least a handful of people, Muslims in the last, say, 15 years, who've said things like, I cannot believe in the Prophet if he did this. Like, I cannot believe this for me is like breaks my ability to be Muslim, right? So it's very interesting. You have something that's a minor detail, which no one really cared about historically. And yet today, but today, it's like really for some people a major, major, major issue, right? And what I think is very interesting about this topic is the importance is not the hadith. I mean, the hadith is not the issue. The issue is our reaction. So, I mean, we can do a study of the hadith about Aisha's age. It's not that interesting. I mean, it's a widely transmitted hadith in sound collections.
Yeah.
But what is fascinating to study is actually our reaction, because that's what is worthy. That's what's worthy of study. The hadith itself is not really worthy of study. It's as unremarkable. It's unremarkable. And the reason we know it, sorry, one of my kids has come up into this other kid's room and is looking through their stuff. Yeah.
I was just saying, it says a lot more about us, I guess, than more about the hadith itself.
Yeah, exactly. So basically and this is, and I won't spend a lot of time on this, right? From the very beginning, it's very important to keep this in mind. The enemies of the Prophet in Mecca and Medina took every advantage they could to attack him. One of the things they attacked was his personal life, alayhi. And we know this because it's mentioned in the Quran, the issue of Zayd and Zainab.
Yeah.
Right. So we know this. Okay. The enemies of the Prophet from the early Muslim period of Muslim expansion into the Middle East. People like John of Damascus died around 740 of the Common Era. They attacked the Prophet for everything they could find, including his personal life, like Zayd and Zainab. People in Latin Christendom attacked the Prophet for every aspect of their life, his life they could, including his personal life, especially the issue of Zayd and Zainab. The issue of Zayd and Zainab comes up over and over and over and over and over and over again in medieval Christian polemics against Muslims, whether it's Middle Eastern Christians, Latin Christians, Greek-speaking Christians, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Okay. None of those accounts ever talk about the age of Aisha. If they talk about Aisha, they talk about how, they say that the Prophet was like obsessed with her. He became kind of obsessed with her and used the revelation to arrange the marriage to her. They don't talk about her age. The first time that I know of that her age is brought up in polemics against Islam is in the late 1800s. I don't even know exactly when, in maybe the 1890s or the first decade of the 1900s. Actually, it's a debate that Mirza Ghulam Ahmad has with a Christian priest, Christian minister. This is the text I sent you.
Yeah.
Right? So we know that people who had every motivation to attack the Prophet, to try and undermine him, and who have a history of going after his personal life, do not talk about his and they talk about Aisha, but they don't talk about her age. That is very, very, very revealing. This was not seen as a locus, as something that he could be attacked for, even by his fiercest critics. That just shows you what I will go into today, which is how much our feelings on the topic of sexuality, sexual availability, maturity, marriage, propriety, etc., how much those have changed. That's the change. It's in our society. It's in global society. It's not about the life of the Prophet. Okay. So here's just, I think, the background. I think this is just some women from Bukhara. I think I found there's like a postcard I bought in Bukhara 20 years ago or something. So it's just some data from world history. In Roman law, the earliest allowed age of marriage legally was 12. So actually, you see this also in rabbinic Jewish law, because that was taken from Roman law. So 12 is the kind of general age at which you can legally get married. Imperial Roman history, so roughly like the 1st and 2nd centuries of the Common Era, you have data from like gravestones and stuff suggests that, or funerary inscriptions, says about 8% of women married at 10 or 11. So you had a lot, almost 10% of women marrying around 10 or 11 years old in the Roman, especially in Italy. A good example of this is St. Augustine, who died at 430, the famous church father. He's from North Africa, from Hippo, and what's today Algeria. When he was 32, he got engaged to a 10-year-old woman, a girl, and they were supposed to get married 2 years later when she turned 12, but it didn't work out. I'm not sure exactly why. So that's just an example. He's just a regular guy who's happened to have one of these, to be engaged to someone at this age. Italy in the 1300s and 1400s, average age for women for marriage was about 16 or 17. So you can see that there's an increase in medieval Italy. This is very interesting. Ralph Fitch, who's like the first, one of the first Englishmen to actually go to India that we know of. He goes on like one of these very early trade embassies to the Mughals, and he goes there from 1588 to 1591. And one of the things he writes about actually is how young marriage ages are there. He talks about one marriage he saw between a boy of 9 and a girl of 6. That people would get married extremely young, but they would only consummate the marriage later. But the consummation around like 10 was totally normal. And actually, one of the interesting things, he actually explains why. Very few places where we have information about this actually have an explanation. He explains why. People want grandchildren while they're alive. And we're going to look a little bit later at, inshallah, at life expectancy. And if you are probably going to die in your 30s, then you want your children to have kids, and to get married and have kids very early. I mean, if you are going to die in your 30s, you want to get married and have kids very early. So the idea of, being in med school till you're 28 or whatever, and then getting married is ridiculous. There was no such thing as med school, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Most people didn't go to any school at all. They were uneducated. They worked in agrarian jobs. And there was absolutely no reason for a human being who was pubescent and sexually active, had sexual desires, for them not to be in a relationship where they could fulfill that. It was pointless. It was pointless not to have that, not to let people, and to put people in those relationships as soon as possible. By the way, one of the interesting things about human beings as a species is we're one of the few species that actually is capable of sexual interest and sexual pleasure before we're actually able to have children. This is very unusual for animals. Like most animals, in fact, most mammals don't actually have sexual interest when they're not in, like, if they're female, if they're not in heat. Humans have sexual interest all the time, and they can have this before they even go through puberty. In fact, it's normal for them to have this. Jean Théneveau, a French traveler in the the mid 1600s in the Deccan Plateau in India, he talks about how it's very normal for marriage to be consummated between boys at the age of 10 and girls at the age of 8. Very normal. Ragusa, which today is known as Dubrovnik in Croatia, in 1458, there's a law that says no Ragusan men could marry women under the age of 14, but 2 years later, this is dropped to 12 for girls and 13 for boys. These are just data points I'm giving you. We don't have a lot of information about this in world history, but I'm just giving you pieces of, just shreds of information here and there. Pre-Ming China, so China, let's say in the 1200s and early 1300s, Average minimum age was about 14 for girls, 16 for boys. So that would be, when people would be getting married, 14 for girls, 16 for boys.
Mm-hmm.
In some U.S. states, like the state of Georgia, in the U.S. South, age of consent, so the age, not the age at which you could get married, which is actually could be any age, if the parents consented, but the age at which you could consent to have sex, even if you were not married, was as low as 10, well into the 20th century.
Yeah.
This is something actually I saw just last week. One of my friend Abdullah Hamid Ali from Zaytuna College posted this on Twitter. Here's something he found. This is actually in this book of 𝐁𝐚𝐥𝐚𝐝, French intellectual and aristocrat in the late mid 19th century, he's actually, I guess he would be super racist, I guess is probably what you'd say. He wrote a book called on the inequality of races. So he's actually one of the architects of modern notions of race, 𝐁𝐴.
Mm-hmm.
And one of the things he says is it's a footnote in his book. He says, according to this Protestant missionary in East Africa, the Wanikas, which is a ethnic group in Kenya, marry at 12, boys and girls, both boys and girls at 12. In Paraguay, the Jesuits introduced the custom, which still holds among many of their disciples, of marrying boys at 13 and girls at 10. So it's the Jesuit priests who are doing this in Paraguay, right? Who are having this carried out in their communities. Widows at 11 and 12 are to be seen in the country of Paraguay. In South Brazil, women marry at 10 or 11. Menstruation both appears and ceases at an early age. Such quotations might be infinitely extended. I will only cite one more. The novel Yo Kiao Li, I don't know how to say that. The Chinese heroine is 16 years old, and her father is in despair that at such age she is not yet married. Now, one of the things you might mention, you see here, is this idea of menstruation ceasing and beginning at an early age. And I think one of the features of Western, kind of modern Western worldview is we tend to universalize our view of the world. Like we think not only should everybody in history think like us, so everybody in history was like basically like a modern day urban American. They just didn't know it. Like in that movie, The Man from U.N.C.L.E. You guys seen that movie? Guy Ritchie directed it. Fellow Brit people.
Yeah.
There's this one guy, this American guy says, he's talking about Germans, like in every crowd, there's an American trying to get out. It's a great line. In every crowd, there's an American trying to get out. So not only do we think that everybody in the world should think like us, but we think that they, in fact, did have our sensibilities. And not just mentally, but physically. So we think that the physical body of a urban late 19th or late 20th, early 20th century urban American is like the physical body of every human being in history. And that what's fascinating is there's actually enormous variation in onset of puberty, enormous variation in onset of puberty historically and between regions. So nowadays we kind of make fun of this. We say, oh, like it's these weird medieval people who thought about like humors and the air and the ether and things like that. But actually, your environment, and we don't know why. We don't know, for example, why in the last 20 years, the average age for the onset of puberty in America has dropped like 2 to 3 years. We don't know. I mean, people have theories about like hormones and food, but I don't think there's actually any established understanding. So this is very interesting. Nobody knows why this happens. Okay, we'll talk more about this. Britain is an interesting outlier. There's like a scene from the Canterbury Tales for you guys because you're in merry old England. So we'll just see why it's an outlier in a second, but here's just some examples. English common law was the first to establish statutory rape laws. I think there was maybe some laws established in the Byzantine Empire in the 6th century, but I'm not exactly sure. But I think these are among the first laws that say if you have sex with someone under a certain age, it's by definition rape. It doesn't matter if they want it or not. You cannot legally have sex with someone below a certain age. Statute of Westminster in 1275 says sex with an underage girl, meaning either 12 or 14. The text is kind of unclear on that. Is illegal. And 1576, the age was reduced to 10. Right. So originally it's 12 to 7. Now, if you notice this, what this is saying is that the age at which many women, many girls in, let's say, the Roman Empire, not only were legally married, but were in fact practically married. And the age at which many people in India in, let's say, the 1500s, 1600s were having sex and married. In England, that would be criminal. It would actually be a crime. I want you to keep that in mind. It's not because British people are somehow more moral or something. We'll see why in a second, inshallah. The wife of Bath in the Canterbury Tales, she talks about how she's married at 12. Remember, the Canterbury Tales are written in the mid-13th century, 1300s, sorry, the mid-1300s. But in Europe, especially Western Europe, marriage age tended to be later. Northwest Europe, the mid-20s. In England, this was the case as far back as 1300. So in England and in Northwest Europe, especially, marriage age tended to be a lot later than these other places we've discussed. In fact, there's a feature that some world historians talk about. It's called the Western European family model, which emerges in the late medieval period in France and England. Among the features of the Western European family model are a relatively late date of marriage, late age of marriage, and two, a large percentage of the population does not marry. Roughly around 20% of the population does not marry. And if you think about like all those, Jane Austen novels and, Hercule Poirot stories and things like that, where there's always like a bunch of characters who aren't married at all. They just never marry. They're not monks or priests, or they just don't get married. This is actually a feature that is kind of specific to this Western European family model, which emerges in the late medieval period. I know people are raising their hands, but I'll try and answer the questions later.
Yeah, we'll do that at the end if that's okay.
James Bruce, he's an interesting guy. He's a Scottish explorer. And he, in the 1770s, he goes to the Hejaz. He actually tries to discover the origins of the Nile. If you can watch that great movie with Patrick Bergin, I think called The Mountains of the Moon, about this search for the origins of the Nile in the 19th century by Richard Burton, the explorer, not the actor. And one of the things he's talking about is how the differences between England and the Hejaz. And he says at 11, in the Hejaz, girls are the object of love and beauty, and they're like perfect age for having kids. But he's like, whereas in England, like he says in England, girls basically are having children by 14. It's very interesting. So, for him, he's not engaged in a polemic or anything. He just happens to note that in England at his time, girls are having kids by 14. That's like kind of a normal thing to happen, which is interesting. Which kind of seems to be on the young side for Britain, but he knows this well. It's just his observation. Maybe it's a little bit young but still it's pretty old compared to like Roman Empire, compared to India at the time. Okay. Late 19th century, there appears to be a major change in norms, especially in Britain. And we have to remember that when we talk about the Victorian period is a British and American period. So the link, the cultural link and interchange between Britain and America in the 19th century and the Victorian period is very strong. So they're both like, and by the way, you note this, if anyone who reads Sherlock Holmes stories knows how often there's characters who go back and forth between Britain and the US. 1860, the British age of consent is actually at 10 legally. 1861 census in England says that over 350 women married at under 15 in just 2 counties that year. So in just 2 counties in 1861, over 350 women married under 15. So you still have this kind of, you're having a lot of women who are actually able to have sex legally and marrying in their teens. Appears to be, as far as I can tell, a very rapid change in the late 1800s. And in one example of this is in the Pall Mall Gazette in 1890 and 1891. There's this series of articles which are kind of like a huge scandal, because what they talk about is how there's all this. One, they talk about how the age at which girls are getting married and having sex in Bengal. So in basically the what at the time was the main the kind of political capital of British India in Calcutta before it was moved to New Delhi in, I think, 1911. And so there's like this anxiety over these poor young Bengali girls are having sex when they're like 9 and 10 years old and being trafficked. And then also in England, there's this anxiety over, oh, and also white girls are being trafficked and they're also having sex. So it's kind of this anxiety over like white slave trade and young girls having sex even in England. And this is like a huge scandal. And it actually changes the marriage age, the age of consent and marriage age from 13 to 16 as in the early 1390s.
Mm-hmm.
Now, I have this in here because I think it's illustrative and it's worthy of keeping in mind. So this is 𝐁𝐚𝐥𝐚𝐝, Christian 𝐁𝐚𝐥𝐚𝐝, famous Dutch Orientalist. He dies 1936. He's an Orientalist. He's also a Dutch colonial administrator in Java. So he writes a book called Mecca. He writes a lot of books. One book he writes about Mecca in the 19th century because he actually pretends he's a Muslim and he goes and like stays in Mecca for a long time. He has great, very interesting observations about Mecca and society in that time. But when he's in Java, one of the things he does is he marries a 13-year-old Indonesian girl.
Right. Okay.
So I think this is really important because, and I don't mean to be nasty about this, but people are always, British readers and American readers are always pulling their hair out and freaking out about the evil Muslims who are grooming the like Asians and Pakistanis who are grooming young white girls in England or whatever. The largest number of like grooming cases are done by white men, just because they're the majority, right? So the sexual interest of adult men in teenage girls is well established. Like that is if you have females who are sexually mature, who are nubile, men are going to be sexually interested in those people. It doesn't matter what age they are. It doesn't matter what law you have. Like those people might feel bad about themselves. They might get shamed. They might be illegal. You might put them in prison, whatever you want to do. Just naturally speaking, if you have females who are nubile, men of almost any age are going to be sexually interested in those people. That's just how human beings function. I'm not endorsing it. That's just a reality. So we can disapprove of whatever we want to disapprove. We can say we think, well, it should be the case or whatever, but let's not lie to ourselves and say that somehow a man who's, let's say 50, who's sexually interested in a nubile girl who happens to be 12 years old, that person is like some kind of monstrosity against nature. That person's actually a very natural case of members of the species Homo sapiens. We can say that's illegal. We can say you shouldn't do that. We can condemn it, but it's not some kind of unnatural occurrence. Mm-hmm. All right. Why is it that there is this change? This is a very interesting question. And again, I want to draw your attention to something that people don't think about, or they think it's some kind of weird, kooky, Galenic notion of humors and the environment affecting you. The environment does affect you. We don't know exactly how, but it does. Okay. And the second example I'll give you is the French historian, intellectual, philosophe, Charles de Secondat, le Baron de Montesquieu, famous author of The Spirit of the Laws and the Decline of the Roman Empire. He says women become nubile in hot climates at 9 or 10 years old. So their children and marriage come at almost the same, childhood and marriage come at almost the same time. Then he talks about in a note how Muhammad married Khadija, means Aisha, at 5 years old and slept with her at 8. And no judgment at all. This is an example for him. He says women in hotter areas they begin puberty earlier. And just look at this thing here. When I read this, it blew my mind completely. Average age for the onset of menstruation, the onset of puberty in Northwestern Europe into the late 1700s was 18.
Right.
I want you to sit and think about that for a second. That means think about those laws on statutory rape in the Statute of Westminster in the 1200s and the 1500s. Those make complete sense. A 12-year-old or a 15-year-old in England in 12 and let's say in 1200, 1300 is like the equivalent of like a 5 or 6-year-old kid today.
Yeah.
The average age for the onset of menstruation in England to the year 1700 was 18. That is probably 7 or 8 years later than it is today.
Today, definitely. Yes.
Okay. Then it starts to drop dramatically, suddenly and dramatically in the 1800s. Why? I don't think anyone actually knows why exactly, but one definite big fat guess is industrialization. Change in diet, urbanization, right? So 1850, 1851 is the point at which over half of the British population, the population of Britain, begins living in cities. So in the year 1851, you have an inflection before this, in human society, in human civilization, and in Britain, the vast majority of people lived in rural areas. Let's say peak of the Roman Empire, only about 10% of the population is living in cities. In Britain, in the year 1851, you have an inflection point. Now, over 50% of the people are living in cities. That point is reached globally around the year 2000. So there's just a huge, the rapidity and the extent of social, dietary, economic, political, cultural change is happening in Britain in the 1800s is unprecedented in human history. The further you'd have to go back to actually human beings settling down in agricultural communities, between 15,000 and 5,000 years ago to find a change that was of similar importance. And it was nowhere near as dramatic.
No. And this was a rapid change. I mean, if you think about how quickly this happened in terms of human history, this was a very
very rapid. I mean, for example, by 1760s, if you just look at people's diaries, at literature, at newspapers and stuff, 1760s in England, in Britain, people are saying, whoa, life is changing now. Like this industrialization, this is not something that's just a factory here or a wool spinning place there. Like this is actually regular people are noticing major changes in life.
Yeah.
Public schooling, this is very important. I know people think this is weird, but this is very important. Public schooling is actually, mandatory public schooling is actually explored, pioneered where? In, like so many things, in British India, amongst the British community in the kind of British settlements in the Raj. Like so many other areas of life, actually kind of the experiments are done in the colonial areas and then brought back to the metropole. In 1902 is when you have required public schooling in Britain. And why is this important? Think about this, okay? Imagine you see there's just a bunch of kids. Like my kids right now are playing with kids in a house, okay? Let's say I don't know these kids. Some of them are big, some of them are small, some of them are mature, some of them are immature, right? If I was going to group them, I would say, okay, big kids over here, little kids over there, mature kids over here, immature kids over there, kids who are playing with Legos go over here, kids who are playing video games go over there, kids who want to play sports go over here, right? I wouldn't say, okay, who's 5, who's 6, who's 7, who's 8, who's 9. This is not a natural way to really register people's existence. Like we go by how they act, how they look, their physical, mental maturity. When you get schooling, especially public schooling, it starts saying, okay, everybody who is 5 years old, everybody who is 6 years old, you're going into this grade. You're going to be in this grade with other 5 and 6-year-olds. The state is going to make sure that everybody who is born in this year is now registered in school. And if you don't, you're going to get a visit from child services or something like that, right? So this government is coming in and is starting to kind of routinize people's lives. And one of the major ways they're doing that is through schooling and based on age. So now, from this point on, the primary way in which people associate with one another is actually through their age cohorts.
Mhm.
Despite the fact, I mean, for example, one of my kids, is in second grade or third grade. I mean, there are kids in his class who are, really tall. There's kids who are really short. There's kids who are really articulate. There's huge variation in childhood development, right? There's people who don't go through puberty until they're in their late teens. There's people who go through puberty when they're in their 8, 9, 10 years old, right? So you can have people who are, let's say, not even pubescent yet, but they're in a class with someone who's gone through puberty like 5 or 6 years earlier. Medical care and life expectancy, this is a huge, huge, huge change. If you are probably going to die at 35 years old, you are not going to sit around and have anxiety about whether you get married at 10 or 20. I mean, you're going to get married and start having kids as soon as it's physically possible. Yes. Otherwise, your family is going to die out. That's what's going to happen, okay? If you have a life expectancy of 70 or 80 years old, that's a very different situation. I mean, it's so different. It's hard to even imagine. Like, it's hard to even put stress enough how big a change in your worldview that would bring about. This is Britain. This is life expectancy at birth. So you've survived, you've been born, you're out, healthy baby, okay? You're out, you're going wang, wang, and drinking milk. How long can you expect to live? Look at this. 40, it's basically 40 until around 1800, and starts to climb. Big increase in the 1880s. Very interesting. We'll see this. What happens in the 1880s? One, really kind of development of germ theory.
Right.
Really like practical uses, practical benefit found from investigation of how diseases spread, diseases like cholera or typhus. I mean, we could think about like modern medicine in a lot of ways, starting with the concern for germs and cleanliness, anesthesia, effective use of anesthesia, widespread use of anesthesia. 1882, I think, is the first time you have like refrigerated trains and refrigeration used for moving things in trains and by boats and in people's houses, even if they want. So refrigeration. Look at this dip here in the early 19 teens. Mm. Maybe that's World War I, Spanish flu is my guess, both of those together. And then look at that increase. Now, it doesn't go back before 1700, but my guess is that before 1700, it's probably going to be pretty standard around 40. Mm-hmm. So you're talking about people in the, let's take 1930s are, almost 1.5% living 1.5 times longer. And today they're living double the length of somebody in 1760. Yes. Of course, they're going to have a completely different view about sexuality, about maturity, about preparedness for sex and all these things. This is the United States. You can see here, maybe this is the Civil War. I'm not sure. Again, you start seeing a real climb in the 1880s. This also probably not World War I, because only about 110,000 Americans died of World War I. But the Spanish flu, and you can see all the way up here into the almost 80 years old. Again, this is life expectancy at birth. This is not taking into consideration, this is someone who was born, a healthy, living child. This is India. Look at this. Life expectancy is basically 25 until 1930. I mean, look at this change. Between 1930, let's take 30 years old, okay? Essentially between 1935 and today, you have, I mean, look at the change here. It's enormous. 30 years to 70 years, double. life expectancy.
Wow.
Double life expectancy in about 60 years, 70, 80 years. So in the lifespan of a person, you have doubling of a lifespan. So a person born, I don't know. I'm not actually sure about that. But a person born today could be living in the lifespan of someone who, when they were born, could have expected to live only 30 years if they were lucky, or if they were the average person. This is Yemen. Until the mid-1950s, you have like the 23, 24 years old.
Well, and that's not so long ago, right? I mean,
Yeah. I mean, think about where are the places when people talk about child marriage, where are the places people talk about? It's always Yemen, Afghanistan, etc. Places where, I mean, within essentially 1 or 2 generations, you had life expectancies in the 20s and 30s. Or it's a place that probably, I mean, I don't have the map for Afghanistan, the graph for Afghanistan. My guess is it's probably pretty similar to this. And in Afghanistan, you have 40 years of war. 40 years of war. I mean, think about what that does to the life expectancy of especially men. I mean, I don't even want to think about what the life expectancy is. I don't know if someone can find it online. What the life expectancy of Afghans is probably very low. And it was probably extremely low until relatively recently.
Yeah.
So it's just really important to think about why we have the view we have about sexuality and kind of appropriate age for sexual interests. This is a recent change in human history. And some places went through this change a lot more recently than others. And arguably, like, still there's places in those societies that have not gone through these changes. And you can see it, by the way, in the US. Where does marriage age start to increase? Where does the marriage age starts to increase? First is in the urban centers of the Northeast. Where does it remain low the longest? The underdeveloped South, rural South. You can just sort of track the progress of industrialization and state penetration of state institutions. And that's where you'll see average age of marriage increase. Okay, so this is just a few more, some interesting things from Islamic history. This is actually from Sahih Bukhari, from his chapter titles. He talks about how Al-Hasan bin Saleh saw, who I'm not exactly sure, I should actually look up who that person is, but he's probably, my guess is someone who's living in the mid-700s Miladi. I met a neighbor of mine who was a grandmother who was 21 years old, 21-year-old grandmother. This is from the Sunan al-Kubra of al-Bayhaqi. Bayhaqi died, Shafi'i scholar from Nishapur, died in 1066. He quotes a Shafi'i, which Shafi'i was at one of his jobs, he was a judge in Sana'a in Yemen. The Abbasids appointed him there. So he says, I met a grandmother who was 21 years old in Sana'a. She menstruated when she was 9. She got married and she had a kid when she was 10. That kid menstruated when she was 9. She had a kid when she was 10. So you had a 21-year-old grandmother. Now, this is unusual enough that they're noticing it, right? This is pretty, this is unusual even for that time, for someone to be a 21-year-old grandmother. But it's not something that they're, this is just like, wow, this is like an interesting case. But it's well within the realm of what they think is conceivable. We have to remember what Tabari says about Aisha's marriage. Radiallahu ta'ala عنها. Tabari died in 310, 923 Common Era. He says that the Prophet ﷺ married Aisha when she was 6, but she was كانت I think صغيرة على الزواج, he said, I think, or كانت صغيرة or something. And so they waited until she was 9 to have the consummation. So he's actually noting that like the reason that they didn't consummate the marriage immediately, she was not yet mature. But she was apparently at 9, and nobody thought this was untoward. There's a Scottish physician actually who's working in Aleppo. He travels to Aleppo in the mid 1700s, and one of the things he notes is that families marry their children off at a young age, but they actually do the consummation when the girl is old enough that they consider to the age at which it's appropriate to have sex. And by the way, that's in general in the madhahib, that's the age at which you have dukhla, like you have the consummation, is at the age حين مثلها يحمل الجماع, right? So the age at which the likes of this person can handle sex. That's the age at which people have sex, is the age at which people who are like them have sex. Determined by custom. 19th century Ottoman Palestine from court records, very interesting. We know that sometimes people would get, we would often get married. They would do the marriage contract when they were in their, even before they were 10 years old. Their families would do it, or their early teens, but that the consummation wouldn't occur until it was deemed appropriate. Sometimes some guy got overeager and did have sex with the wife before that, but this was like condemned socially. And if the family brought this to the judges, then they would reprimand the person. It was like kind of a big scandal, but it generally didn't happen. But if it did, it was condemned socially. 1830s, the famous British Orientalist and lexicographer Edward William Lane talks about Egyptian women. They married as young as 10. He had, by the way, a Greek slave woman as his sexual partner. I don't know how old she was. Egyptian women married as young as 10. Few remain single by 16. And that women tend to arrive at puberty much earlier than the natives of colder climates. So again, we have this idea that, he's noticing a difference between Northern Europe and Egypt. Washington Irving, who's an American author, he wrote, among other things, The Legend of Sleepy Hollow. So if you ever heard of the story of the Headless Horseman, that was written by him. He actually wrote a book in 1849 about the Prophet Muhammad. He spent actually 2 decades, I think, writing the book, working on it. And he talks about his marriage to Khadijah, his marriage to Aisha, and he says, she got married to her when she was 6, and they consummated when she was 9 or 10. And he's absolutely no judgment. He says females soon bloom and ripen in those eastern climes. They just mature earlier than where we are. Again, I mentioned this earlier. The first kind of problematization I've seen of this is actually in this debate, which I think happens in the 1890s, because it's not dated, and I haven't looked into it enough to find this information. But it's a letter Mirza Ghulam Ahmed writes to a British priest he's debating with. And in 1905, the Scottish Orientalist and Oxford professor of Arabic, David Margoliouth, he's on the picture on the right, he talks about his marriage to Aisha as, quote, an ill-assorted union, for as such we must characterize the marriage of a man of 53 to a child of 9. Of course, it's very funny when you think about the Prophet's marriage to Aisha. Did Aisha suffer from this? I mean, Aisha is one of the most famous women in the history of the world. I mean, she's like a major, not only she's famous because she's the wife of the Prophet, but she's also the most influential woman in Islamic thought, in terms of fiqh, in terms of theology, in terms of interpretation, in terms of political leadership. I mean, I don't think there's, I don't know, I've never really thought about this, but I think it would be hard to come up with a woman who is more influential in world history than Aisha. So I don't really think it's fair to say that she's somehow like some damaged item that was traumatized by this marriage. I mean, I don't know. I think this is an unfair assessment by Margoliouth. I don't see how you could say that this union worked out for the worse for Aisha. I just don't think that's a possible interpretation, no matter what one's view is. This is just an example. If anyone my Urdu is basically non-existent now. So anyone who wants to read this and translate it for me, I would be very happy to send this to you. Only condition is you got to send me a translation. This is Mirza Ghulam Ahmed's kind of debate he has with this Christian priest. These are just some marriage ages of Muslim scholars I've come across over the years. Tajuddin Subki Akbar, the Mughal Sultan, 1605, died. It was at 9, Ibn Abdul 14, Shawwal 14. Okay, I'll do questions. Let's see here. Stop share.
Thank you very much for that. Nice quick switch journey there.
Okay, so it says, could I change the picture, please? What's that mean?
I think you can ignore that one. If you go to where it says open, so open questions, can you see that? Can you see the questions coming in front of you?
Open questions?
Yeah, can you see like a
Oh, Q&A. Okay, I see. Yeah. Okay. Given that we see the Prophet Muhammad as an example to guide us in our day and age, why should we consider Hazrat Aisha's age as something not to ponder upon? I mean, you could ponder upon it, but things like marriage age in the Sharia are based on custom. So, I mean, it would be, in my opinion, I'm just a professor, but in my opinion, it would be like grossly irresponsible to marry your daughter off at the age of 9 if you live in like High Wycombe. I mean, it would be you're talking about somebody who's grown up in a society that they are they're almost certainly not physically mature, and they're nowhere near prepared to be married.
Yeah.
It would be a grossly irresponsible action, in my opinion, as a parent. And by the way, the Prophet ﷺ himself did not marry his daughter to I actually believe it was Abu Bakr who asked, if I'm not mistaken, the Hadith and Sunan Nasa'i. He says like you're basically too old for her. So the decision about what age you want to marry your children at is, as in terms of the guardian of that girl, or even during the life of the Prophet, he did not he encouraged people to marry other people whom he wouldn't encourage to marry others, or some people he encouraged to marry at certain times and not other times, right? So it's really based, I think, on what's best for that person and their capacity. And I think it would be very hard to come up with a situation in which somebody who was 9 years old in urban America or Britain would be appropriate for them to marry. I just don't think it would be a very good idea. So it's always good to ponder the sunnah of the Sahaba and of the Prophet ﷺ. But what I see when I look at their marriage customs is actually just a wide range of flexibility and wide range of options, not one even the Prophet ﷺ, his first wife was significantly older than him. So, I mean, what you have there is a huge range of possibility, and you choose within that what is most appropriate and best for your family. Why was the region for age of onset increased? I don't think anyone really knows the answer, except that just kind of post hoc ergo propter hoc reasoning, after which therefore because of reasoning, which is that you have this kind of unprecedented change in human life in Britain in the 1700s, 1800s, and right alongside that, you have this huge change, biological change in average onset of puberty in an area that was actually previously a real outlier, I think, in a lot of ways in world history. So it's not surprising. I mean, I don't know exactly how it happened, but I think that it's probably a pretty good guess that industrialization had something to do with it. Can I share your thoughts on Joshua Little's work on Aisha? That's not Abdurrahman Mustafa, who was my student, is it?
I'm not sure. Could be.
Okay. Student slash friend. I don't know if it's Abdurrahman, but if it is, I don't know. You can write something. Or if not, then hi, Abdurrahman, who I don't know. So I read his dissertation. I talked to Joshua about his work. I disagree with some aspects of his work. And he's free. He's not here to defend himself. So I offer him the chance to defend himself. But so my problem with his argument is that,
Sorry, Jonathan, can I just for the benefit of our viewers, could you summarize in a sentence or two what
so his argument is basically that the hadith of Aisha's age is made up in Kufa in like the time by Hisham bin Urwa, basically. So in the kind of mid 700s, mid to late 700s. And it's made up to make the Aisha seem like a kind of counterpart to Fatima. It's sort of like a Sunni counterpart to this like virginal figure of Fatima.
Right.
Now, I don't buy with that argument for a number of reasons. One is, why does saying that somebody got married when she was 9 make her look like like a particularly pure person? I mean, there's a lot of other ways to do that don't involve marrying her at 9, having her married at 9. The other arguments are based on the idea that, like, in these Shiite texts, legal texts, that they say that some opinions say that the youngest a girl could marry is at 9. And therefore, like, the idea is that the Sunnis would want her to have married at that time as a kind of competition. But this is one of my main arguments, is that the sources that those Shiite narrations are found in are 100 to 200 years later than the sources that the Aisha hadith is found in, right? So if we're supposed to think that Islamic tradition has this problem of the sources come along later, we don't have any contemporary evidence of what's happening in that period of time, there's all this forgery that happens. Why should I if I have like the hadith of Aisha's age is in like Musannaf Abdurrazzaq Sanani. Abdurrazzaq Sanani died in 827. Okay.
Yeah.
Why should I take a report from 150 years later and think that his report 150 years later is somehow authentic and this is the one that's made up? Like, you need to first establish that this is reliable as having come back from the time of the Prophet before why should this thing could have been made up to look like Sunnis. They should say this based on Aisha's age, who knows? So I don't think this is really so basically there's no reason. I mean, think about this, right? Let's say the Prophet goes outside of his house one day and says, it's a nice day. Like, the Prophet obviously said something during his 63 years of being alive, right? Like, he didn't just not say anything. So he clearly said something. So why is it that we doubt certain things he said, allegedly, from Western scholarly perspective? We say, okay, I think this is not something he said because it was made up to serve a certain agenda.
Mm-hmm.
But if you can't really prove what that agenda is, there's no reason to doubt. Like, there's no debate that I know of about Aisha's age. Like, it's not like who's the first caliph. If you have a report where the Prophet says, the first person to succeed me should be Abu Bakr, and anyone else who says differently is wrong, like, someone could say, oh, well, this is made up by Sunnis. Or if the Prophet says, Ali should be my successor, and anyone who says otherwise is crazy, like, okay, well, maybe that's made up by, someone could make an argument. There's a clear debate there. But where's the debate around Aisha's age? It's only if you assume that there's some indirect debate about her purity to compete with Shiite claims, but that's a very tendentious argument. And it's also based on the evidence for it is actually appearing much later than the Sunni sources that we have her age concretely mentioned. And even if we're going to say that we can't push them back earlier, like date them earlier than the time of Abdurrazzaq Sanani or something, that's still significantly earlier than the time that the Shiite material that we're allegedly using as the example for the Shiite polemics against Sunnis on this issue. So I think that's my main debate with it. I don't know if that was clear enough.
Oh, fair enough.
Are you providing indirect arguments for later marriages? Definitely. Are all provided indirect arguments arguing for later marriages definitely wrong? Is there some historical basis for marriage of Aisha? I mean, I'm not going to argue. Like, I think they're not. I don't want to say they're wrong. Like for me, they're just not that convincing. I mean, if you say, Aisha's sister was at this age, and we know she was this age at this battle, and this battle happened in this year, and then Aisha got married at that year, therefore she must have been this age. Like, there's a lot of steps in that argument where if there's a lot of room for error, right? If anyone's wrong about any of those things. Whereas somebody saying, I was 9 years old when my marriage was consummated, that's if someone wants to know like what year I was born in, unless you have really good argument that I should, like if I say I was born in 1977, unless you have like very strong evidence that that's not the case, then I'm probably the one who knows. Or like, I was 10 years old when I was 32 when I got married. Sorry, I hear screaming in the background. I don't know if it's like normal screaming or not normal screaming. So if I say I was 32 when I got married, or I was like, I was 10 in 1988. So in 1988, I was 10 years old and I was in fourth grade. I'm confident about that. Unless you have very good evidence for that, then my opinion should be the one that determines that. So that's my main argument. Yeah. They could be right. There's other arguments to be right. This is not like a issue that is aqidah or even like fiqh important, in my opinion. So I don't think anyone can be called, the worst you could say is that you're denying the authenticity of a hadith that's ahad hadith. Okay. I mean, so I'm misguided or I'm a bad person or I'm making a mistake. That's what you could say, but I'm still a Muslim. I'm still a Sunni Muslim. So, I mean, even if you deny that she was 9, it's just a disagreement of opinion. Mm-hmm. Nowadays, if there is a clash between custom and individual preference for a girl who lives in a society where she is expected to marry 16 when instead she wants to pursue a higher education, which side would the Sharia favor? Yeah, I don't know. I'm not a Mufti. Yeah. I mean, that's a good question, but I am not qualified to answer. So if you have other people who can answer this question.
Thank you. I just want to say something that when I first heard the early murmurings of this controversy, if you call it that, my immediate response was that if this was problematic, this age debate, then we have to ask the question, why is it the muhaddithin throughout Islamic history, number one, mentioned it without any sort of like real consternation about it? And if they had some consternation about it, surely they would have tried to explain it away or, hide it. But the fact that they kept it in there and nobody had an issue with it just shows, for me anyway, as a believer, an integrity of our tradition. Like scholars, whatever reached them, they passed it on. And that's just a simple sort of way of just thinking about this. If that makes sense.
I think it's important to remember that the life of the Prophet, ﷺ, Muslims actually have already been through a period of intense social change. And that was actually the time of the companions and the successors. The first 50 or 60 years of Muslim history were a period of enormous social change. Enormous social change. I mean, Muslims went from being the same people who were literally tending sheep and camels and scraping by a barely subsistence life in the Hijaz. Those same people were governors in Damascus and Isfahan and Marv and what becomes Cairo, etc. Those and Alexandria, those same people, not their kids, those same people. They went from a place where they didn't have bathrooms. They didn't have a place you went to the bathroom to being in like Roman baths, marble Roman baths. And you can see this in the fiqh when they're talking about like facing the Qibla in the bathroom. There's a very big difference between facing the Qibla in the bathroom when you're in a Roman marble bathhouse versus like on the roof of your house or something, or like out in the desert and you can see the Kaaba. There's a big difference, right? So they talked about this, and you see it a lot in the opinions of the Sahaba and the Tabi'un. They'll say like this during the time of the Prophet, we did this. Things have changed. Things have changed.
Yeah.
So the time of the life of the Prophet was very far removed from even the time of Bukhari, Imam Bukhari. That's why one of the first genre of writing that emerges, the first type of books we have written in the Hadith tradition are actually Gharib al-Hadith books. Abu Ubayd al-Qasim bin Salam died 224. His book on Gharib al-Hadith is one of the earliest books we have in Islamic history. We have actually a copy of it from before 300 Hijri. It's one of the first things they start doing is writing down. There's a lot of words in hadiths that even scholars in Baghdad in like 700, or sorry, not 800, they don't know these words. They're like, this is a world that is just vanished, like the desert and these weird camels and animals that live out there. This is not the world of Baghdad.
Yeah. I wanted to shift, if I may, I'm cognizant of time as well, the conversation slightly. One of my pedagogical concerns is that sometimes when I'm having these conversations about the age of Aisha, may Allah be pleased with her, is that sometimes that can cloud or cover some of the more important conversations that we could potentially have about her contribution to Islamic thought. I mean, you've alluded towards it. I'm thinking about Zarkashi's work, for example, the famous one, Al-Ijaba li-irada
Istidrakat, Aisha.
Yeah, just reading that, I mean, you alluded towards it, showing her immense scholarly credentials, her ability to speak to the companions. I mean, in Hanafi madhab, the one I'm trained in, she's important for us because she's an important transmitter, but also what we would call a fuqaha sahaba, which in our epistemology plays an important role. And I think sometimes when we get into these debates, and I think there's a place for it, we sometimes lose sight of her larger contribution that she still continues to make to this very day.
Yeah, I think that's I think the fact that we're always talking about her age and not her contribution is indicative of the kind of self-centeredness of this discussion. I mean that and it's hard because like if when I think about the Prophet marrying a 9-year-old, like it seems like it's weird to me. Like it's weird to me. It makes me feel uncomfortable, right? I mean, I'm a product of my time. I'm a product of my time and my place. But you need to, like, the world doesn't revolve around your feelings and what you think is right. Believe it or not. Like, not everything in world history and not every meaning and aspect of truth in the universe is determined by like what some New Yorker at a cocktail party thinks in like 2011. Right. That's just or like some tipsy Nigel guy, outside a bar on like a street in London. Just that these people we have to be modest in world history. We really have to be humble and realize that we are people. Like there are many, many, many generations of human beings who are just as smart as us and probably more pious than us, and just as aware of all the things that we're aware of. Like they came before us, and we share the earth with them. We share history with them, and we can't act like our concerns are the only ones in the world. And when we do that, we just end up doing exactly what you're saying, which is we end up focusing on and kind of making our discomforts into these just global sized anxieties, as opposed to thinking about something that's obviously much, much more important, just objectively much more important, which is Aisha's contribution to not just Islamic history, but world history. I mean, why isn't Aisha talked about as like one of, maybe she is, I very rarely, she's probably the most important woman in world history.
Yeah.
I mean, I can't think of woman who's more important.
And that's maybe one of the ways that we should be framing it as we go forward.
Yeah, she's like, Aisha's the most important person in world history. I mean, look at her political role, fiqh role, aqidah role, historical role as a transmitter of information about the life of the Prophet, just the details of his life. That's very, I mean, I can't think of few men, by the way, have, even in the Muslim community, have that big a role, even among the companions.
Yeah, yeah. I just want to end, and I just want to say thank you to Professor Jonathan coming on once again. But I want to give you an opportunity, given that we are looking at the life of the Prophet, peace be upon him, and we're trying to use his life in, especially times today where there's rampant Islamophobia, you've got global conflict, you've got elections where politicians are going to use all sorts of divisive tactics, even here in Britain, which is normally known to be quite a stable sort of political world, but we're not seeing that anymore. It's becoming very Americanized, and no offense to you, but our political world is becoming very, very divisive here. And we've been seeing the deployment of Islamophobia even by elected officials. I want to kind of give you an opportunity to talk about maybe how we can use his life as a source of inspiration, as a source of, I mean, one of the things I tell my students is we've got to continue doing the work. And just yesterday, I delivered a khutbah, and I only took the phrase, as you know, in hadith about when a prophet received revelation. And one of the things he said to Waraqah bin Nawfal when Khadija came to him was, "Awa mukhriji yahum," are they going to kick me out? And it was a very, I found that little Arabic phrase very pithy and very fascinating about, he realized that he's going to be in a very difficult situation. And it dawned upon him that even though I received revelation, it's not going to be an easy existence now. And kind of just, can you kind of share some insights about why it's important to study the seerah, why people should continue engaging with the life of the Prophet, given the context that we're living in?
I mean, I can't, I mean, my opinions are, no more important than, the average Muslim person in this regard. But I mean, I think one of the things you see in the life of the Prophet that's the clearest in the way he deals with the community around him is he's very conscious of like perception, and he's not, I don't want to say he has principles, obviously, but he understands that you can't just, you always have to think about what the impact of what you do is, right? So if you might be insulted by Abdullah bin Ubay, right? And you might be insulted horribly by him, and your companions might want to kick this guy's rear end. But you say, I don't want people to say Muhammad kills his companions, right? So you have to be aware of how you're perceived, right? And not just think that you act on principle and therefore everything goes well, right? So principles are important, and of course you don't violate. Like if someone says, here, have a glass of wine with me, and let's like all be British, and I don't say, okay, yeah, well, I'll do this because I want you to like me. No, obviously there's principles that there's rules you don't break. But when it comes to, we always would think about how what we do is perceived as, right? And that has to be taken into account in the way we think. That's one of the things I've seen in the life of the Prophet. He's a very, very contextual person. Like his approach to being in Mecca at a certain time is very different from being in Mecca later on. It's very different from being in Medina, right? You know what I mean? And he's always principled. He's always consistent in his message, but he's very aware of what are if I make this decision, what's the consequence going to be? How are people going to see it? Is that damage going to be worse than what it would be if I did something else? So I think that's, for me, is very inspirational because it's very easy to think that being a leader is always about being kind of rigid. And I don't think that's oftentimes what being a leader is about. I think it's being very smart and knowing like how to see differences between situations and how principle applies here but not there. And that's tough because the Prophet, that's something he faced this with his companions. I mean, there were times when his companions really like disagreed with what he did, like the Hudaybiyah treaty. I mean, they really, like, some of them were like, I don't think this is correct. And if it weren't for his authority, they might not have agreed. I mean, as someone who is less charismatic than him might not have been able to convince them. So sometimes leaders are going to they're going to make decisions that people in their community, some elements in their community really disagree with, and that's going to be a consequence. I think that's inevitable. I don't know if that's helpful.
No, it's useful. I mean, the
Yeah.
perceptions are important, especially given that many of us living in the West, and we are interacting with non-Muslims on a day-to-day basis, at least in Britain, the small island that we live on. And so politicians or people who want to spread hatred can say what they want, but it's how people perceive us ultimately in our day-to-day interactions, which will sway people's views on Muslims. I mean, I've been tracking some of this a little bit on social media and other places where, you'll have a politician or someone or some commentator say something really bad about Muslims, but there'll be also comments saying, well, you're talking rubbish because my friend Abdullah is not like this, or my neighbor Sumaya, she's not actually like that. And so, and that's because of their interaction and their perception and how they meet Muslims every day.
A lot of people become Muslim because I mean, it's tough because Muslims are really hard on themselves. A lot of the time when you talk to Muslims, they're just, we're horrible, we're backward, we're this, we're always, but Muslims are great people, man. I've met nothing but just wonderful people since being Muslim. And there's some bad people, but I mean, just look at one of the things I don't like about recent phenomena is the kind of like, act right or whatever, these kind of like guys on social media who say really nasty stuff, like who talk really, they think they're pious, but the way they speak is not pious, like but even looking at those guys, look at the type of speech discourse you see online in like non-Muslim circles. It's significantly worse. I mean, significantly worse.
Mm.
I mean, Muslims will never say something like, I'm gonna, stuff like, I'm gonna do this to your mom, or I'm gonna do this to your dad, So I think the Muslims need to be aware that they actually have a lot to offer from their akhlaq and their tradition. And people, when they see that, a lot of times they're very impressed.
Mm.
And we don't appreciate how much we have to offer other people. And that, I think that's important.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think we have to end there. I just want to say once again, thank you so much. I know it's the weekend and it's family time for all of us, so I do appreciate you giving your time. I hope that we have you again with us on Balagh as part of our offerings and our courses. There's a lot of people. It's a global audience, so a lot of people do come on and benefit. So please do, everybody else, please do continue following Professor Brown. He's always approachable. I know he's a busy person, he's a family person, but he's always there to help. And it's a real honor to have him as part of our ummah and as a part of our community.
I'm the one who's honored, people. Let's be honest. I'm the one who's honored. And I hope I get to see you guys in person, inshallah.
We'll see you in all Blighty at some point, inshallah.
Yeah, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum, everybody.
Thank you, everyone. Assalamu alaikum.